What is up, everyone? Corn O'Keefe back yet again, and as the title implies, I'm bringing you Frozone from The Incredibles versus Mr. Freeze from DC Comics. A badass ice manipulating hero versus a badass ice manipulating villain. So without further ado, let's get down to business. I'll go ahead and start off with Frozone himself. Starting off with the attack power of Frozone, or should I say the physical attack power of Frozone. Being a superhero, we know Frozone is physically superior to police officers and athletes. However, his physical attack power is not the only thing that he has to bring to the table. As we know, Frozone is known for manipulating ice, and his ice has proven to be pretty potent. A good example of the potency of his ice is shown during The Incredibles 2 when he helped slow down a cruise ship. But arguably his best feat comes from the first Incredible movie, specifically when he was able to keep the Omnidroid busy for a while with his ice and was even able to briefly restrain the Omnidroid at certain points. The same Omnidroid who overpowered Mr. Incredible himself. Moving on over to speed. Frozone is pretty freaking fast. Heck, the dude was fast enough to freeze a bullet, easily giving him Mach 2 speeds, aka supersonic speeds. In terms of his reaction time and his attack speed with his ice, Frozone's reaction time and overall short burst combat speed should at least be comparable to Mr. Incredible's reaction time and short burst combat speed. The same Mr. Incredible who was fast enough to avoid a plasma blast from the Omnidroid, which puts Mr. Incredible at least around Mach 100, aka massively hypersonic reaction time and short burst combat speed, and in turn gives Frozone massively hypersonic reaction time and short burst combat speed. In terms of durability, Frozone's durability is obviously superior to any athlete, and heck, the dude was able to survive extremely casual strikes from the Omnidroid. Now, looking over at Mr. Freeze, in terms of Mr. Freeze's physical attack power with his suit, we've seen Mr. Freeze casually rip 2 reinforced metal doors off their hinges, and he's physically strong enough to trade blows with Batman and damage him. The same Batman who is durable enough to withstand a tank shell and survive an exploding school. But similar to Frozone, Mr. Freeze's physical attack power is not the only thing that he has to bring to the table. Yes, folks, I'm talking about his ice and the potency of his ice. Specifically, the potency of his ice that comes from his freeze gun. For starters, even an older model of his freeze gun was capable of freezing entire city blocks. Heck, one of his more upgraded freeze guns was powerful enough to briefly restrain Superman himself. His freeze gun should also be comparable to Captain Code's Code Gun, which was capable of briefly holding back Superman's heat vision. Moving on over to Mr. Freeze's speed. Mr. Freeze is fast enough to react to bullets, and has consistently kept up with Batman in combat, and has been able to tag him on multiple occasions with his ice. Now, in terms of durability, Mr. Freeze consistently takes strikes from Batman, and was completely unaffected by a store-sized explosion. Well, I went over attack power, speed, and durability for both of these ice manipulating badasses. Now, like always, it's time for me to tell you who should be taking victory more often than not, as well as go over some X factors. And folks, if I'm being completely honest, I think Mr. Freeze should be taking victory more often than not, and here's why. In terms of attack power, it's pretty clear Mr. Freeze takes it in both physicality and with his freeze gun. Sure, Frozone is physically superior to police officers and athletes. At his peak, his physical attack power should easily be street level, possibly even reaching the wall level ranges. However, that doesn't compare to the physical attack power of Mr. Freeze. As mentioned, Mr. Freeze casually ripped 2 reinforced metal doors off their hinges and has consistently traded blows with Batman and damaged him. the same Batman who withstood a tank shell and survived an exploding school. And yet, Mr. Freeze, with his physical blows, is powerful enough to damage Batman's physical durability, easily putting Freeze in the building level ranges in terms of his physical attack power. As far as the potency of their ice, Frozone helped slow down a cruise ship and stop it, which is easily a building level feat for his ice. But that doesn't even compare to Mr. Freeze's older model of his freeze gun, which was already capable of freezing entire city blocks. And yeah, Frozone did manage to keep the Omnidroid busy for a while, and briefly restrained him at certain points. However, it is worth noting that he really didn't do much to the Omnidroid at the end of the day, and the Omnidroid itself was extremely casual during this point in the fight. But nonetheless, this does support Frozone's ice being around the building level ranges in terms of attack potency. But hey, you could argue it's even higher. As mentioned, this Omnidroid did overpower Mr. Incredible. Mr. Incredible has actually shown town level feats and scaling. So if we're being really nice, we could actually say Frozone's ice is around the town level ranges, since he was able to keep something busy and briefly restrain something that was able to overpower somebody who has shown town level feats and scaling in his own right. But even if we said the potency of his ice is around town level, that actually wouldn't compare to the potency of Mr. Freeze's ice from his freeze gun. If you remember, Mr. Freeze with his freeze gun briefly restrained Superman, aka the Man of Steel himself. And his freeze gun is at least comparable to Captain Code's code gun, which briefly held back Superman's heat vision. This is the same Superman who has consistently shown universal level feats. And sure, Superman was probably holding back, but hey, even a small percent of universal is still vastly above the town level feats and scaling that Mr. Incredible himself has shown. It's honestly not a comparison. As far as their physical durability goes, it's pretty clear Mr. Freeze takes physical durability for similar reasons as to why he takes physical attack power over Frozone. So, we've established Frozone won't even be able to physically harm Mr. Freeze. He's not durable enough to withstand Mr. Freeze's ice or his physical blows. And the potency of Mr. Freeze's freeze gun is far above what Frozone has demonstrated with his ice manipulation. So what about speed? Maybe Frozone's speed could help him take victory here, seeing as he should at least have Mach 100 reaction time and short burst combat speed, aka massively hypersonic, scaling to Mr. Incredible, who dodged a plasma blast. But that doesn't even come close to the speed of Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze is fast enough to consistently keep up with Batman in combat. And if you remember, Batman has actually dodged light speed attacks on more than one occasion. Like when he dodged lasers, dodged Dr. Light's pure light-based attacks, and avoided Green Lantern's light, which is literally pure light. And yet Mr. Freeze is fast enough to consistently keep up with this guy. So Mr. Freeze is going to be able to easily avoid all of Frozone's attacks, including his ice. But unfortunately for Frozone, he won't be able to avoid Mr. Freeze's attacks, especially his ice. Yeah, Mr. Freeze can physically keep up with Batman in terms of combat, but his ice is also fast enough to tag Batman, which means it's going to be way too fast for Frozone to avoid. In terms of skill and overall experience, we know Frozone is in his 30s, meaning he easily has 3 decades of experience going up against all different types of supervillains. He's an extremely skilled bowler, and heck, he even designed his own super suit. Mr. Freeze, on the other hand, has decades of experience going up against all different types of heroes, which includes the entire Bat family. And while he may not be a master martial artist like Batman and the rest of the Bat family, he's still skilled enough to go toe-to-toe with them in a fight. Heck, Mr. Freeze has even created a machine that was stated to be advanced and on par with technology that Lex Luthor himself created, and possibly technology that was created by the new gods. So yeah, Mr. Freeze should definitely be taking overall experience and hand-to-hand skill as well. Frozone has never went up against somebody who is as intelligent and who has as much skill as somebody like Batman. And while creating his super suit is very impressive, it doesn't compare to somebody who can create a machine that is comparable to Lex Luthor's own inventions, and possibly even comparable to inventions that the new gods themselves created. As for X Factors, ironically, Mr. Freeze has an X Factor that would absolutely devastate Frozone, and that would be Mr. Freeze's flamethrower, aka one of Frozone's greatest weaknesses. You could say it's Frozone's own kryptonite. As we know, fire and hot temperatures drastically weaken Frozone's power. And you might be thinking to yourselves, well, won't this flamethrower actually affect Mr. Freeze? And the answer to that is, it's highly unlikely. You see, Mr. Freeze has actually survived in a fireplace while his armor was damaged, and has even nullified a fireball with his freeze gun. So obviously Mr. Freeze's own flamethrower shouldn't have any effect on Mr. Freeze at all. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Frozone. Overall, Mr. Freeze has greater attack power in terms of both physical attack power and with his freeze gun. Either one could easily devastate Frozone's durability. Mr. Freeze is durable enough to take Frozone's attacks and is more than fast enough to avoid all of his attacks. His intelligence, skill, and overall experience are far beyond anything that Frozone has ever shown. And Mr. Freeze has an X Factor that is literally Frozone's kryptonite. With all that being said, I think it's definitely safe to give Mr. Freeze the victory more often than not. But let me know what you all think down below. As always, have a blessed day, folks. Peace.